How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
California has been an environmental leader since John Muir advocated for the creation of Yosemite National Park more than 100 years ago. On climate, California has been on the vanguard under the guidance of Republican and Democratic governors. Today we will discuss California's environmental and climate prowess with three distinguished guests. Huey Johnson is founder of the Trust for Public Land and a former California Secretary of Natural Resources. He currently runs the Resource Renewal Institute. Jason Mark is editor of Sierra Magazine and author of the book Satellites in the High Country, Searching for the Wild in the Age of Man. David Vogel is author of the book California Greenin, How the Golden State Became an Environmental Leader. He's a professor emeritus of business and politics at UC Berkeley. Later in the show, we'll explore what it would take for California to go carbon neutral. David Vogel, California's been first in a lot of environmental efforts, starting in 1947 with the first state air pollution law. Tell us some other important measures that California established that then went across the country.
Well, it was the first unit of the United States to regulate automobile emissions, which began in California and then became national and spread to other states. Energy efficiency for appliances began in California and became national. Energy efficient building codes began in California and became national. The Coastal Initiative played a very important role in creating both national and local coastal management practices throughout the United States. So California, from beginning in the 1860s, by protecting Yosemite, has long been on almost every dimension the environmental leader in the United States.
Great, and we'll drill down into some of those topics. Huey Johnson, you founded the Trust for Public Land, an organization that then grew across the United States. One day you were walking by a park in San Francisco. There were some elderly Chinese people exercising, and that was an inspiration. Tell us that story.
Well, I had an early morning meeting, and I was walking by Washington Square with a city official to go to the meeting, and a lot of people were out there exercising. And he stopped and he said, "That's their living room." And I said, "Oh," and we kept going, but I remembered that it really made an impact on me. So I started a thing called the Trust for Public Land, and it would have an urban emphasis. And we went around and had great success. We went to the banks and the savings and loans companies and said, "You've got all these properties you're foreclosed on. If you give them to us, we can give you a tax credit. Otherwise, you're never going to get anything for them." So we got a whole bunch of properties and established community gardens, schools, housing, a lot of things. I was kind of brand new, and all my staff people were looking at me saying, "Well, what are we going to do?" And I had to make a decision to do something. We had supposed to acquire a property, you know. And somebody said, "Well, this property is for sale." And it was beautiful. It was 1,600 acres in the corner of Belize Lagoon, all the way up to the ridge. Then I called the Park Service. I was all excited, thinking, boy, they're going to be happy. And they didn't answer the phone. And I kept trying to call them, calling Washington. And finally, they called back and said, "Johnson, we know what you're trying to do. We don't want that property. We don't want an urban park." A guy named Nat Reed was a tough and wonderful environmentalist. And so I got an appointment with him, and I went in and talked to him, and I said, "This is what I want to do. Here's my first project." He said, "Great, that's a good one." I said, "But the Park Service said they don't want it." He said, "What?" He yelled at his secretary and said, "Get the head of the Park Service and his head of acquisition down here now." They sat down and he said, "What is this that you don't want to buy a bargain?" They said, "Nothing." And one of them said, "Yes, Mr. Secretary, we don't want an urban park." And he said, "Really?" He said, "Well, let me tell you something. The president does. The president's my boss, and I'm your boss, and you're going to tell me what you're going to do. I'm going to tell you what you're going to do." And he said, "Now I've got to go to lunch." He got up, and the two Park Service guys got up and go, "It's not you, you're staying here and you're going to buy that property. And he went out the door. And that was the first property, the Trust for Public Land. And right now, the state of California up at Lake Tahoe is going to let a state park become a golf course. And Dianne Feinstein is behind it, and she has Goldman Sachs golf course division out in front. And you've really got to fight the bastards. The battle is never over.
So where some people would say, there's new land to be saved, Huey Johnson, you're saying people need to protect what has been saved because it can be unsaved.
That's even more important. We pretty much saved the places that need to be saved. And there'll be others, but places are being lost because there's no defense for them.
And is that increasing now with, obviously, the Trump administration, Bears ears, certain things being rolled back? Jason, Mark, have you done reporting on that?
Yeah, sure. It's awful what the Trump administration is doing to revoke national monuments that were established lawfully under the Antiquities Act. I'm trying to think of, again, if we're trying to keep it California-centric, some wonderful places that started out as national monuments became national parks. You'd have Death Valley. You've got Joshua Tree. Help me out here. I'm trying to think I don't think Kings Canyon Sequoia was originally, but again, you can see, another use of where California in some ways was a laboratory. That said, I do think the kind of emerging cutting edge of where the Sierra Club is and where other major conservation and environmental groups are is ensuring that the 21st century environmental movement reflects the ethnic diversity of this country. You don't need to go to the very remote wilderness. Yes, it's fantastic to go to Yosemite, go to Kings Canyon or Death Valley, but there's a lot of virtue in the nearby nature, right? In these urban parks, in places like the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, or one of our newer national monuments, the San Gabriel Mountains in Los Angeles, right? Where a plurality of people who recreate in the San Gabriel Mountains are Latino families.
David Vogel, one of the keys to California leadership that's spread around the country and around the world is the automobiles, 1950s. So tell us about that particular era where there was this post-war expansion. So much came out of that era of LA in the 50s. Fast food, McDonald's came out of that. Yet there were some real tensions between smog and the automobile.
Well, LA began in the 1890s as a health resort. Because it had the best climate of any city in the United States because it had no coal. And all these people would come to Los Angeles because it had beautiful air and you could be there during the summer without having to worry about because there was no air conditioning, it was pleasant. And then, of course, LA by the 1940s had the worst air pollution in the United States, and no one could quite figure out why. And in 1949, there was a football game at Cal, Washington State playing the Cal Bears. And during that day of the game, people in the stadium and along the route of the cars began to experience the same kind of tearing and coughing that characterized smog alerts in Los Angeles. And that was the first inclination, the first idea that cars could be a major source of air pollution. And that started a trajectory that needed to be more research, et cetera. And by the early 60s, California, understanding that cars uniquely were the major source of pollution in Los Angeles and in California, enacted the country's first automobile emission standards. And that really was linked to the fact that LA remains very unique in that it has an unusual density of automobile use and volume, as well as, of course, its topographical problems keeping all the smog in the city.
And so the Trump administration, which nominally supports states' rights, is trying to say California can't set more stringent air quality, actually fuel efficiency standards, which was one of the pillars of really the Paris Climate Accord.
Right.
Because that really led the U.S. into Paris. So what's at stake there? Is this going to be drawn out in court for a long time? Because the Trump administration
it's very consequential because curbing automobile emissions is very critical to California's climate change goals, greenhouse gas emission goals, and to air quality. We're driving more and more, and the only way to keep air quality and greenhouse emissions under control is to have better pollution controls, including electric cars. The Statute 67 very clearly specifies the criteria by which California must meet to deserve more stricter standards. I think it meets that criteria, and we'll see how it plays out.
What's industry's position? Does industry want this?
One hears the industry would have preferred a compromise, which California and the federal government would have worked out some modification of the standards, and it looks like the Trump administration is giving the industry much more than it actually wanted. The industry's nightmare, of course, is that they relax federal standards, which they can do, and California keeps its exemption, and thus we have a two-tier car market. California and 13 states, one kind of cars, the rest, another kind of federal standards. That's the nightmare for the industry.
Some would say the environmental movement, J.C. Mark, is radical and anti-business and holding California back.
I think the environmental movement is a big tent, and I think it includes a lot of people who identify or come to environmentalism or conservation from many different doors, and that's what you want. And so, yes, some people are going to be on the radical anti-capitalist fringe, and some people are like the Nature Conservancy of today, working very closely with Dow Chemical. And the question is, how do you kind of hold that space for people of common vision, common values, to work toward a more or less shared goal, and recognize that it requires many different tactics and strategies and many different approaches. And so I think that's the challenge right now, including, I think, for a big, what would be called a big green group like the Sierra Club, where it's certainly a significant, I think, force within the movement. And at the same time, we've continued, I think, to hold on to our grassroots edge because we are a democratic organization where the members elect the board of directors.
Rare among environmental groups.
And we really are member-led. I mean, all of our chapters nationwide and our multiple chapters here in California have a high degree of autonomy and influence.
David Vogel, are we making enough progress? Are we getting on a hopeful note here?
I don't think we're making enough progress, but I think we should be pleased and impressed and gratified with how far we've come. I mean, this is the 5th largest economy in the world, okay, growing more rapidly than almost any other state, and the quality of its environment, the trees, the coast, the air. This is incredibly precious and impressive. And given the level of economic and population growth of this state, the extent to which it looks and is such an attractive environment nowadays is, I think, a miracle. I can't speak for the future, but through the present, it's a very impressive accomplishment.
California generates nearly half of its electricity from renewable sources and is committed to reaching 100% by 2045. Next, we'll explore what it would take for California to go even further to become carbon neutral. Mary Nichols is chair of the California Air Resources Board, a position she has held since Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger appointed her in 2007. Bob Holycross is global director of sustainability and vehicle environmental matters at Ford Motor Company, which is a financial supporter of Climate One. John Hoffmeister is former president of Shell Oil Company. This program is underwritten by our friends at the Climate Works Foundation. Mary Nichols, let's begin with you. What is the vision, what is the path to a state, one of the world's, 5th or 6th largest economy,
Yes.
5th now,
Yep.
going carbon neutral? No other country or economy so big has put that out there.
Well, there are several other countries and regions that are now looking at carbon neutrality as the goal. We call it climate neutrality because we're looking at all the gases that contribute to climate change, not just carbon. And that's an important fact because there are gases out there, particularly methane, but also refrigerants, black carbon, that are doing a lot of damage right now and that we can do something about before we may be able to completely reverse the trend to build up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But it's not a simple question to answer. It clearly requires us to look system-wide, not just sector by sector, cars, fuels, industry. for the first time, we really have to look at our entire economy and all of our activities and say, how are we going to restore balance? How are we going to restore health? And that includes looking at our soils, our forests, our ecosystems as well.
John Hofmeister, when you hear a big ambitious goal like this of a big economy getting to zero net emissions, is that something you think is pie in the sky? Is it something you think industry could support?
The industry that I come from, the oil and gas industry, is the kind of industry which, when you're dealing with the long-term thinking leaders of the industry, they want to get behind it. They actually want to make it happen. They want to see what can be done. Now, they take, in my experience, a balanced view of what's the reality of, let's say, oil and gas looking forward. And I would say if I spoke for the industry, I don't actually technically speak for the industry, but I'm still very close to it. If we look ahead over the next 50 years, which is the normal time frame for energy companies to look ahead, what we're looking at is virtually the complete electrification of the personal transportation fleet. That's a given. Nobody's too worried about that. Maybe the motor car companies are worried, but the oil and gas industry is pretty well set that it's going to be electrification of the personal transportation fleet. But that doesn't mean it's the end of oil and gas, because you have the whole freight industry, which is going to be more difficult to electrify. You have the marine industry, which is not going to be electrified, and maybe end up using LNG for its fuel on ships, but is more likely to continue to use diesel for decades to come. You have the aviation industry, for which there's really no alternative being pursued in any scalable way. And then, of course, you have the petrochemical industry, which is going to carry on for decades and decades into the future, all of which represents demand growth worldwide over that 50-year period. So what the industry is converting its thinking to, and you haven't heard much about it yet because the industry is a bit introverted about these things, and they don't talk until they have something to really say. But what is growing, and in the last 2 weeks I've been to 2 meetings in 2 universities on the same subject, and it is the introduction and creation of the carbon management industry, where the technologies and the technological minds of the industry will convert themselves into figuring out how to make a business out of carbon by taking it out of the atmosphere, taking it out of what people worry about, so that as you look ahead to 2070, you'll be looking at a continued use of carbon-based product, but with an industry that is getting rid of it.
Bob Holycross, when you hear about electrification of everything, California going to zero emissions, how does that approach, how do you think that as an automaker, does that sound like a challenge? Does that sound like something that's remote or threatening?
No, I think it's a challenge, but it's also a significant opportunity. And I think in terms of the progress that the industry has made and that we at Ford have made, it's a path that we all have to be on. And the interesting piece now that we're at is as we start to get consumers more and more familiar with this technology and realize the benefits that it provides beyond just being zero emissions transportation, but being fun to drive, being functional, overcoming some of the anxieties that maybe consumers originally had about these vehicles, the possibilities start to expand greatly. And then when you think about what other things you can do with these vehicles in terms of connectivity, the services that can be provided, it really starts to change the equation. And so this is a really interesting and exciting time to be in our industry, and at Ford, we're really excited about the investments that we've made and how we're re-engaging consumers to look at these vehicles in a different way.
Ford, I think it's fair to say, hasn't really been a leader in electric cars. I've looked up the sales of plug-in cars at Ford. You know, the C-Max was 28,000 units cars in 2014. It was 6,000 in 2018. The Fusion was 300,000 units cars in 2014, 173. So sales of Ford cars with a plug are going down, while John Hofmeister and others are saying the industry is going electric. So are you falling behind?
No, I don't think so. And in reality, with the vehicles that we had on the market, I mean, you named a number of different vehicles. So we have had offerings in electrification out for some time, and including a fully electric battery vehicle in our Ford Focus as well. And we learned a lot from those experiences. And we're in the position right now of transitioning our fleet and spreading it more into the nameplates and the vehicles where we have leadership in those. So while the numbers on an individual basis maybe aren't as high as some might have expected, collectively at the time when those vehicles were in the market, we actually had leadership in terms of overall volume. And we're looking forward to 40 all new electric vehicles coming over the next 4 years. By 2022. We made an $11 billion investment and are on our way to electrifying some of the most popular nameplates we have, like the Mustang and the F-150. And at the end of next year, we'll come out with our next generation fully electric vehicle, which I think will intrigue many consumers in terms of its styling and functionality.
We're going to go to our lightning round. I'm going to ask our guests name a noun and ask you to mention the first thing that comes to mind, unfiltered, with complete disregard and abandon. Mary Nichols, what comes to mind, the first thing that comes to mind when I say Western States Petroleum Association?
Dinosaur.
John Hofmeister, Tesla.
Can it make it through the financial wilderness it's in?
Bob Holycross, the Chevy Bolt.
The what?
John Hofmeister, California Governor Gavin Newsom.
I met him when he was was the mayor of California, mayor of San Francisco, and we got on quite well and had a very warm and engaging conversation at a mayoral conference, and so I look forward to seeing what's next.
Mary Nichols, EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler.
Struggling to figure out how to do his job of protecting the environment while at the same time deregulating everything.
Bob Holycross, true or false? This is true or false. True or false, Bob Holycross. In her 10 years as California's top official for clean air, Mary Nichols has done more for climate protection than any other single policy leader in the country.
Absolutely true.
There we go. There we go.
True or false, Mary Nichols, Ford Motor Company is on the progressive side of the auto industry.
True. True.
Also for Mary Nichols, true or false, the cheating on emission tests by VW, Mitsubishi, Mercedes, Honda, and other car makers may be repeated as long as there is a financial incentive to do so.
Absolutely true.
John Hofmeister, true or false, if energy companies burn all of the oil and coal reserves currently on their balance sheets, we will live in a destabilized world of hurt.
I don't think so. I don't think we know how much is really out there in the world of tomorrow. And if we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and there are 9 billion people on Earth instead of 7 billion people on Earth, the mix of the energy portfolio of the future, I think, is something we have to really think about, including the supply chain that is undeveloped yet for electrification. And for the supply, just as it's taken years for the supply chain for wind and solar, we need to develop the supply chain for lithium and other products that will affect electrification.
True or false, Bob Holycross, all transportation is subsidized.
False.
Also for Bob Holycross, true or false, California has a good track record defending its environmental policies in court.
True.
Mary Nichols, true or false, there's a lot of opportunity to improve the efficiency of the internal combustion engine, which turns only about 20% of its energy into forward motion.
You know, amazingly, that is true. Every time, it seems like almost every decade, we have slashed the emissions and improved the efficiency of the internal combustion engine, and people have said you couldn't do more, and still we keep on doing more. It's been a really tenacious technology.
True or false, John Hofmeister, Trump is nuts.
I think of the word scalawag more often than not.
Bob Holycross, true or false, you really don't want me to ask you if Trump is nuts.
True.
All right, that ends our lightning round. Let's give them a round for getting applause. Bob Holycross, we're talking about climate disruption. Another disruption I know that Bill Ford thinks about is artificial intelligence, robots making robotic cars. Talk to us about the job displacement that may come. Robots are coming for all of our jobs, it seems. I've even seen a robotic or a computer-generated talk show host. A hot world with, artificial intelligence, what is that? Those things coming together could be a lot of disruption for the automotive industry.
Yeah, again, disruption, but not to overuse it, but opportunity. So when it comes to the manufacturing facilities of the future, there's no doubt artificial intelligence is going to play a role, just like it's going to play in the vehicles that we use. So it really becomes about upskilling and reskilling and transitioning. How we make vehicles and how we design the vehicles themselves to operate in this new world. So there's a lot of considerations that have to come into play in terms of whether it's cybersecurity and those different types of issues to make sure that they're safe. But the opportunities in terms of efficiency. And what it can do in terms of, from a manufacturing perspective, to have reduced emissions from the manufacturing sector, I think is something that's really important, and we're on our way to doing.
Is the center of gravity and innovation in the industry? I mean, cars are becoming tech platforms, right? Mm-hmm. Mobility, teenagers think of them as just moving, entertainment platforms. Is that moving from Detroit to Silicon Valley? Where the energy, Apple, Waymo, all these companies are here in California.
Yeah, I think it's definitely spreading around the globe, and we've definitely been engaged out here in California, and we have our expanded research campus in Palo Alto. But we've made a significant investment back in Detroit as well with the central train station that we bought in Detroit, and some of the other investments we've made in the Corktown district, where we've moved the hub of our electrification and autonomy operation into those areas. So Detroit is going to continue to be a very important center for the technological advancement in our industries. But I would say it's really expanding around the globe, whether it's in China or continuing to be in Europe as well.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows recorded with a live audience are available wherever you podcast. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody.